dragged, shamed, and silenced. Before the crowd, an Apache stood with the Cayuse woman. They broke. They dragged her into the town square just as the church bell finished its second strike of noon, rough hands gripping her arms while her heels scraped helplessly over the packed dirt, the sound of it drawing people from doorways and shaded porches like a signal they all understood too well. And she did not scream, not because it didn't hurt, but because she had already learned what screams earned you in a place like this. Her hair had come loose from its braid, dust clinging to her cheek, her dress torn at the shoulder where someone had yanked her harder than necessary, and when they forced her to stop in the center of the square, every eye settled on her at once with a hunger that made her chest tighten more than the grip on her wrists ever could. Someone laughed, another spat near her feet, and a man she had never seen before shouted something about blood and lying, words she had heard whispered before but never thrown at her so openly, and the sheriff stood nearby with his hands resting comfortably on his belt, as if this were nothing more than a demonstration meant to keep order. They called her a deceiver, said she had no right to work among them, no right to speak in their town, no right to stand upright at all. And when she tried to lift her head to answer, a sharp shove to her back forced her down to her knees in front of everyone, the crowd pressing closer as if her humiliation were a fire meant to warm them. It was then that she noticed the Apache man standing near the edge of the square, tall and still, his posture unmoving amid the shifting bodies, his face unreadable, but his eyes fixed not on the men shouting but on her, and she looked away quickly, afraid that meeting his gaze would somehow make this worse. The sheriff raised a hand and declared that she would be silenced until the truth was decided, and the word silenced seemed to give the crowd permission, their voices rising together as one ugly sound that swallowed her name, her past, everything she had tried to bury just to survive. She felt a hand push her chin down again, forcing her eyes to the dirt, and that was when a single step broke through the noise, slow and deliberate, followed by another, the Apache man moving forward until he stood between her and the thickest part of the crowd, his presence alone drawing murmurs and uneasy pauses. He did not touch her, did not raise his voice, did not challenge them with threats, but when the sheriff told him to step back, the man didn't move. And in that stillness, heavy, defiant, unmistakable, she felt something shift for the first time that day. Not safety, not yet, but the dangerous, fragile idea that someone had seen her dragged and broken before the crowd and chosen to stand anyway. The moment stretched after the Apache refused to step aside, thick with the kind of tension that made even the boldest voices hesitate. But it did not last long, because crowds like this never let silence win for very long, and soon someone scoffed loudly enough to give the others permission to breathe again, laughter rippling outward in uneven bursts as men shifted their weight and women leaned forward with narrowed eyes, eager not to miss what came next. The sheriff's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking between the man who would not move and the woman still on her knees in the dirt, her hands trembling now despite her effort to keep them still. And he reminded everyone loudly that this was about order, about lies that needed answering for, about a town protecting itself from what did not belong, words that sounded practiced, worn smooth by repetition. Someone threw a small stone that struck the ground near her knee. Another voice called out that she should be grateful they were letting her live at all, and she felt the heat of shame crawl up her neck as if it were a living thing, knowing that every second she remained there made her smaller in their eyes. The Apache stood close enough now that she could see the faint scar along his jaw and the controlled rise and fall of his chest. And though he still had not spoken, his presence drew sharp looks, the kind reserved for men who did not know their place or refused to accept it. A shopkeeper she once traded bread with muttered that this was proof of what happened when you showed mercy to the wrong kind. And another man nodded eagerly, shouting that she had tricked them all, that her silence was proof enough of guilt, ignoring the way her throat worked uselessly as she tried to form words past the fear pressing down on her lungs. The sheriff ordered the crowd to hold, announcing that she would be kept there until evening if necessary, made an example of so no one else would forget where the line was drawn. And at that, her strength faltered, the thought of hours under their eyes more terrifying than the hands that had dragged her out. The Apache finally spoke then, his voice low but clear, cutting through the noise not with volume but with certainty, saying only that enough had been done, that the town had made its point, and that no truth was ever found by breaking a woman in front of witnesses. The reaction was immediate and ugly, shouts rising, insults flung at him now too, warnings about staying out of matters that weren't his. But he did not answer them, did not defend himself, instead shifting slightly so his shadow fell across her bowed head, blocking the sun and the worst of their stares. She realized then that the crowd wasn't angry because she had lied, or because she had broken some rule they cared about, but because someone had disrupted the simple comfort of watching another human being brought low. And as the afternoon dragged on with no one willing to be the first to leave, she understood with aching clarity that this town would never look away on its own, and that standing beside her meant choosing to endure their cruelty for as long as it took. As the sun crept past its highest point and began its slow lean westward, the square took on a restless edge, boots scuffing, throats clearing, impatience simmering beneath the noise. Yet the Apache remained where he was, feet planted as if the ground itself had claimed him, and that refusal unsettled the crowd more than any shouted challenge ever could. Men tried to stare him down and failed. Women whispered that he was enjoying the spectacle, that he was no better than the one kneeling there. And still he did not rise to it, his eyes level, his attention steady, a quiet that felt deliberate rather than weak. The woman's legs ached from holding her weight so long, pins of pain crawling through her knees, and when she swayed, he shifted just enough for his arm to brush her sleeve, not grabbing, not lifting. Only a wordless reminder that she was not falling alone, and the contact sent a shock through her that had nothing to do with fear. The sheriff circled once, boots crunching, and asked the Apache his name, his business, his reason for standing in a matter that did not concern him, and the man answered calmly, offering his name without embellishment and saying only that what was done in public concerned everyone, especially when it was done to someone who could not fight back. That earned another wave of laughter, sharper this time, a man shouting that she could fight just fine when it suited her, that her silence was an act, a trick learned somewhere else, and the words landed heavy, pressing her shoulders lower until she tasted blood where she bit her tongue to keep from crying out. The Apache turned then, not toward the voice but toward her, meeting her eyes at last, and in that brief moment she saw no pity there, no curiosity either, only a steady acknowledgement, as if he were recognizing something already decided between them. He asked the sheriff plainly whether there was a charge or only a show, and when the sheriff hesitated, answering with talk of investigation and caution, the Apache nodded once, as though that were confirmation enough, and said he would remain until a charge was named or the woman was allowed to stand. The thread in that was subtle but unmistakable, not of violence but of endurance, of a man willing to stay as long as it took, and the crowd felt it, their energy shifting from excitement to irritation, because nothing soured a spectacle faster than a witness who would not leave. The woman's breath came shallow. Now, exhaustion creeping in, yet beneath it stirred something unfamiliar, a thin thread of resolve she had not known she still possessed, and as the shadows lengthened and no one dared be the first to back down, she understood that the Apache's refusal to move was not meant to save her in a single moment, but to force the town to confront how long it was willing to keep hurting someone simply because it could. The sheriff finally lost patience with the stalemate, his voice hardening as he declared that the woman's silence was reason enough to hold her, that law did not require comfort, only compliance, and with that pronouncement the crowd found its footing again, laughter bubbling up as if order had been restored by a sentence spoken loudly enough. A deputy stepped forward and warned her that any further resistance would earn her irons. His words meant more for the watchers than for her, and when she tried once more to speak, her voice came out thin and unsteady, swallowed immediately by jeers and a chant. Someone started near the saloon steps, turning her name into a sound stripped of meaning. The Apache said nothing, but the muscles along his jaw tightened, and he shifted closer, not shielding her fully. Only enough to make it clear that whatever was done to her would be done with him watching, a detail that seemed to irritate the sheriff more than open defiance ever could. The lawman reminded the square that this was how order was kept, that examples had to be made so decent folk could sleep easy, and a few nodded eagerly, relieved to be on the side of authority, while others laughed because laughter was easier than doubt. A woman from the crowd shouted that the accused should be grateful for mercy, that in other towns she would already be gone, and the word mercy landed like a mockery, drawing fresh amusement and another shove that tipped the kneeling woman forward until her hands caught her weight in the dirt, grit grinding into her palms. She heard someone say, "This was what happened when you trusted the wrong face." Another voice adding that she deserved worse. And with each remark, the space inside her shrank, the urge to disappear pressing harder than the pain in her knees. The sheriff announced that until evening she would remain there, silent by order, and any man who interfered would answer for it, his gaze lingering on the Apache as if daring him to test that boundary. For a moment it seemed the threat might work, the square holding its breath, and then the Apache spoke again, not to challenge the order, but to ask a simple question about food and water, whether the law intended to deny those as well, and the crowd erupted, mocking the concern as weakness, as proof that he was tangled in something beneath him. Yet the question lingered, uncomfortable in its reasonableness, and when no answer came, he removed his canteen slowly and set it on the ground within her reach, a small act that drew gasps and curses in equal measure. The sheriff barked that this was not permitted, but the Apache did not touch her, did not force her to drink, merely made the choice visible, and in doing so exposed the thin cruelty beneath the law's calm face. And as the afternoon wore on and laughter curdled into impatience, it became clear that silencing her had not brought peace, only revealed how easily law and mockery could join hands to keep a woman on her knees. It was the preacher's wife who finally broke the quiet with a question spoken too loudly to be innocent, asking why the town should keep defending a woman who had never belonged to any of them, and the sheriff seized on it with visible relief, repeating the word belonged as if it were the key that would end the unease spreading through the square. Someone called out that she had lied about where she came from, another that her past was not what she claimed, and the murmurs gathered shape, tightening into something sharper as the accusation found its mark, because lies were easier to punish than cruelty. The woman felt her throat close as the truth she had guarded for years pressed up against her ribs, heavy and dangerous, and when she finally lifted her head, dirt streaking her cheek, her eyes met the Apache's again. Searching for something she did not yet have words for, the sheriff announced that it had come to his attention. She was Cayuse. The name dropped like a stone into water, sending ripples of reaction through the crowd, surprise giving way to recognition, and then to anger that felt rehearsed. Men nodding as if this explained everything they had already decided. Voices rose at once, some saying the word with contempt, others with fear. Old stories dragged up about bloodlines and betrayals, about a people blamed for wars. Most of those shouting had never seen, and the woman flinched as if struck. The sound of her own identity turned into a weapon. She had learned long ago that names could be more dangerous than knives, and she had buried hers because survival demanded it. Yet here it was again, exposed in front of everyone, twisted into proof that she deserved the dirt beneath her knees. The Apache did not look away when the word Cayuse was spoken, did not stiffen or recoil, only shifted his weight slightly as if absorbing the meaning and choosing where to stand with it. And when the sheriff asked him pointedly whether that changed his mind, the pause that followed seemed to stretch longer than the hours she had already endured. The crowd leaned in, hungry now, convinced this was the moment the man beside her would step back, that blood would finally matter more than presence, and the woman's breath caught as she braced for the sound of boots retreating. Instead, the Apache said quietly that names explained history, not worth, and that whatever she had been born into did not give the town the right to break her. And the words struck the square harder than any shout, because they left no room for the comfortable lie that cruelty was protection. The reaction was immediate and fierce, insults thrown like stones, warnings hissed about what it meant to side with a Cayuse woman, yet beneath the noise something irrevocable had happened, because her truth was no longer hers alone to carry, and the man standing with her had heard it, understood it, and chosen to remain, even as the crowd's hatred sharpened with new purpose. The shift was immediate once the Apache spoke her name without shame, the crowd turning on him with a unity that felt practiced, as if they had only been waiting for permission to choose a new target, and the sheriff's face hardened not with surprise but with calculation, because a man who refused to bend complicated things in ways the law preferred to avoid. Whispers cut sharp and fast, calling the Apache a sympathizer, a traitor to order, a man who would bring trouble down on the town if he stayed, and he listened to none of it, his attention remaining on the woman as she struggled to rise from her knees, legs trembling too badly to hold her yet, until he finally offered his hand, palm open, not pulling, not rushing, simply there. And when she took it, the square erupted in angry sound. The sheriff warned him that interference had consequences, listing them calmly as if reciting known facts: loss of work, loss of protection, loss of whatever standing he thought he had earned by keeping his head down, and the Apache nodded once, acknowledging the cost without argument because he had already counted it. A man from the crowd shouted that no one would trade with him again, another that he would be watched, and a third laughed that he would regret choosing a Cayuse woman over his own future. The words meant to sting more than threaten, and perhaps they did. But if so, he gave no sign. He helped her to her feet slowly, keeping his body angled so she could lean without falling, and for the first time that day, she stood upright in the square, swaying but standing, her eyes level with those who had tried to erase her. And the change unsettled them, their power dulled by the simple act of a woman no longer on her knees. The sheriff declared the gathering finished, not because justice had been served, but because it was slipping from his control, and ordered the crowd to disperse, promising that the matter was not closed, that consequences would follow, his gaze lingering on the Apache with a warning that felt colder than any shout, as people drifted away reluctantly, some hurling final insults, others watching in uneasy silence. The Apache remained where he was, waiting until the square thinned enough that the woman could breathe without 100 eyes pressing in. And only then did he turn to her and speak quietly, telling her she could walk if she needed to, that he would stay close until she was safe. She realized then that standing beside her had already changed how the town would see him, that whatever name he carried here would be altered by this choice. Yet he had made it without hesitation. And as they moved away from the square together, the cost of that stand followed behind them like a shadow, long and unavoidable, but no longer hers to bear alone. By the time dusk settled over the town, the square had emptied, and the day's cruelty lingered only in scuffed dirt, and the memory of voices that refused to fade, and the Apache guided her along a side street where lantern light fell soft and uneven, giving her eyes somewhere safe to rest that was not on faces waiting to judge. Her steps were slow, each one testing whether her legs would obey, and when she stumbled, he adjusted without comment, shortening his stride so she could keep pace, the quiet of it more comforting than any promise spoken aloud. They stopped near a low stable behind a closed store, the smell of hay and animals grounding her in something ordinary, and he offered her the canteen again, watching the doorway rather than her as she drank, a small courtesy that eased the tightness in her chest. For a while neither of them spoke, the silence no longer heavy but careful, as if words might disturb the fragile balance she was only just beginning to feel. When she finally found her voice, it came out rough, thanking him for standing when he had no reason to, and he answered simply that he did, that reasons were something people invented after the fact, not before. She asked if he knew what would come of it, the watching, the closed doors, the way a town could turn cold without warning, and he said he had lived long enough to know that standing always cost something, but that not standing cost more. The lantern flickered as a breeze passed through the alley, and she told him then about the years she spent hiding her name, moving where no one asked too many questions, working harder than required just to remain unnoticed, and how even that had not been enough to save her from the square, the words coming out in short bursts as if she feared they might be taken from her again. He listened without interruption, eyes steady, and when she finished he did not offer comfort or judgment, only said that survival did not require shame, and that anyone who told her otherwise had confused cruelty with truth. The sound of distant laughter drifted from the saloon, a reminder that the town was already turning the day into a story that suited it, and she flinched, knowing tomorrow would bring whispers and looks sharpened by rumor. The Apache asked where she would go, and when she admitted she did not know, that every place in town felt smaller now, he considered for a moment before offering to walk her to the edge to make sure she was not followed. No further claim than that. As they moved through the deepening night, the fear did not vanish, but it loosened its grip just enough for something else to take its place, a cautious sense of trust born not from grand gestures, but from the steady presence of a man who had stood in daylight and now walked beside her in the dark, asking nothing, promising little, and proving more with each unhurried step. The knock came well after midnight, hard enough to rattle the thin boards of the small shed near the riverbank where she had taken shelter, and she woke with her heart already racing, the memory of the square flooding back before her eyes even opened, because cruelty rarely ended cleanly and never without witnesses. The Apache was awake before the second knock landed, rising quietly and moving to the door with a calm that felt practiced, placing a hand against the wood as if to steady the moment itself, and through the cracks they heard voices they recognized, low and tight, the kind used when men believed the law would look the other way. Someone said the town had been patient enough, another that letting her leave had been a mistake, and when the sheriff's deputy named her blood again, turning it into a justification, she felt her breath hitch, knowing this was the hour when examples were finished, not started. The Apache opened the door just enough to step outside, closing it behind him without drama, and she strained to hear, catching fragments of warning and accusation, the promise that this would go easier if he stepped aside now. He answered evenly that the town had already said what it meant to say in daylight, and that nothing done in the dark would make it right, a response that drew a bitter laugh in the scrape of boots moving closer. Fear pressed against her ribs, sharp and immediate, yet she stayed where she was, remembering the way he had stood earlier, refusing to move, and understanding that panic would only make this worse. A shadow crossed the thin window as a man leaned in, threatening consequences that no one would talk about later. And the Apache replied that if they wished to take someone, they would have to do it with names attached, in the open, not hidden behind night and numbers. The words slowed them, hesitation creeping in as the reality of being seen tomorrow, of being known, settled over the small group. And for a moment the river filled the silence, steady and indifferent. One man spat and said this was not over, that she would not be protected forever, and the Apache agreed, adding that neither would they, not if they continued to mistake cruelty for order. Eventually the boots retreated, curses thrown over shoulders as they went, and when the sounds faded into the night, the Apache remained outside a moment longer, listening until he was certain they were gone. When he returned inside, she saw the tension finally leave his shoulders. And though the danger had not vanished, something had shifted again, because they had come to finish what the crowd began and had failed, not through force or spectacle, but because one man had refused to let them do it unseen. And in that refusal, she found a fragile certainty that whatever followed, she would not face it broken and alone. Morning came with a thin gray light that made the river look flat and cold, and when they walked back toward town together, the quiet felt heavier than the noise had the day before, because silence carried memory more faithfully than sound. Word of the night visit had already spread, carried by glances that lingered too long and conversations that stopped when they passed. And by the time they reached the square again, a small crowd had gathered, not with the hunger of spectacle, but with the uneasy curiosity of people sensing that something had gone wrong. The sheriff stood near the same spot as before, his posture stiff, flanked by the deputy who had knocked in the night, and the Apache did not wait to be questioned, speaking first and calmly, naming the men who had come after dark, naming the threat plainly without embellishment, and in doing so, dragging what was meant to remain hidden into the open. The square shifted, murmurs rippling as faces turned, because daylight had a way of changing loyalties, and men who were bold in shadows suddenly found their boots interesting. The sheriff tried to frame it as misunderstanding, as concern taken too far, but the Apache asked him whether concern required secrecy, whether law hid itself behind midnight doors, and the questions landed harder than accusation ever could. The woman stood beside him, hands clasped tight to keep them from shaking, and when the sheriff turned to her, demanding she confirm or deny the story, the square went still, every ear waiting for her voice to fail, but it did not. And though it came quietly, it carried, recounting the knock, the words spoken, the fear intended. And the moment she realized they had planned to finish what daylight had begun. Something broke then, not her, but the careful balance the town maintained between cruelty and respectability. And people began to speak, not in defense of her, but in defense of themselves, distancing quickly from what could no longer be ignored. The sheriff saw it slipping and made a choice of his own, ordering the deputy dismissed pending inquiry, promising consequences in a voice that rang hollow but necessary, because the crowd required an ending it could accept. It was not justice in the clean sense, not restoration or apology, but it was exposure, and exposure carried weight in a place that relied so heavily on secrecy. As the square dispersed again, quieter this time, the woman felt the knot inside her loosen. Knowing the town had not become kind overnight, but it had been forced to look at itself, and that mattered. The Apache did not claim victory, did not linger, only turned to her and asked if she was ready to leave the square for good, and as they walked away together, she understood that justice had not come through fists or fire, but through the simple, dangerous act of refusing to let cruelty remain unseen. They left the town before the sun climbed high enough to burn away the morning's cool, taking the road that followed the river out toward open land where fences thinned and judgment lost its certainty. And with every step the woman felt the weight she had carried begin to shift, not gone, but no longer crushing her chest. She walked beside the Apache without hurry, aware of the quiet space between them that needed no filling, because what had bound them was not promise or romance, but something steadier, forged under eyes that had tried to unmake her and failed. When they reached a bend where the town disappeared behind trees, she stopped and looked back once, not with longing, but with clarity, understanding that what had been taken from her there could never be returned, and that what remained was enough to build from. The Apache waited without pressing, and when she turned back to him, she told him she would not hide her name again, that if the world wished to break her for it, it would have to do so in daylight. And he nodded, saying that names spoken aloud lost some of their power to wound. They made camp by the river that evening, firelight low and practical, and as she tended a pot with hands still marked by dirt and strain, she felt a strange steadiness settle in, the kind that came not from safety guaranteed, but from dignity reclaimed. He spoke then of moving north, of work where questions were fewer and hands mattered more than origins, and he did not ask her to follow, only offered the road as it was, open and uncertain, and when she said she would walk it with him, the choice felt neither sudden nor dramatic, but inevitable in the quiet way truth often arrived. The night passed without interruption, and in the morning they continued on, two figures growing smaller against a wide land that did not care who they had been kneeling before a crowd, only how they moved forward now. She understood then that what the town had tried to break was not her body or even her name, but her belief that she was allowed to stand, to choose, to be seen without apology, and that belief had survived the worst they could give. As the road stretched ahead, she did not know what waited beyond the next rise, whether welcome or hardship, but she knew this much with certainty. She would never again confuse silence with safety, and the man walking beside her had not rescued her from the world, only reminded her that dignity, once claimed, was a thing no crowd could ever fully take away. Some wounds are meant to be hidden, not because they are small, but because the world teaches us silence is safer than truth. But every so often, someone refuses to look away, and in that moment, shame loses its power. This was not a story about a crowd that learned mercy, but about two people who chose dignity when it cost them everything. And sometimes, that choice is the beginning of a home.